The smell of moldy account books and dried ink lingers in the basements longer than the names on the coats of arms. On the tables are neatly bound stacks of papers promising to compensate for shame, measured by the weight of silver. Under these agreements, a young wife becomes a risk table, and a wedding becomes an insurance event. While new tablecloths are laid out, and sweet wine is served in the bourgeois neighborhoods, a different arithmetic is being worked out in quiet offices. Contributions arrive on time. Payments never do. Hello, friends. Your narrator here. Write in the comments where you are watching from, which city and which country. It is important for me to understand how far our story reaches. Make yourself comfortable, put your work aside, and if you can, turn off any unnecessary noise around you. Enjoy listening. In a city that is referred to in chronicles as free, but in reality is held together by oaths, coins, and fear, a new fashion among wealthy families emerged at the end of the 16th century. Under the chime of the town hall clock, under the rule of the House of Habsburg, and local statutes approved by magistrates, wealthy merchants and suppliers to the court had contracts where the events of the wedding night were described as insurance risks. The papers promised what could not be promised. If the marriage was disgraced, they would pay an amount covering the loss of reputation, possible refusal of the groom, or recalculation of the dowry. The contracts were euphemistically called honesty policies. In the markets, clerks said that this was a civilized tool for an era where honor was equated with credit. The notary's books contained sheets with the seals of large trading houses. Next to them were neat boxes with sealing wax, where the agreed terms were stored, not to disclose, not to present the document without the groom's consent, to confirm the event by experts. The experts were people who had neither a university medical education nor a church mandate to investigate, but who had letters of recommendation from a broker. The scheme looked flawless, precisely because there was nothing in it that could be verified. The conditions emphasized that the fact of a disgraced marriage was established by the conclusion of two discerning persons appointed by the mediator. Families paid annual fees, hoping to get protection from rumors, sudden changes of heart by the groom, and excessive control by relatives. In reality, they got a certificate with no weight or seal. The clerk of the city court, a man whose hand was accustomed to three things: statutes, penalty books, and registers of guarantors, noticed a recurring pattern in the reports. Money moved to the broker, from the broker to his experts, and then back to the mediator's house as fees for consultations. There are no payments in the books. Rather, there are lines about partial consolation, which in total do not even amount to a tenth of what has been paid over the years. The bourgeoisie, convinced that insurance was a sign of modernity, accepted this novelty as part of the general discipline of money. The city lived on trade interest, kickbacks, duties, and commissions. The church repeated in its teachings about mutual consent between spouses, but over the course of a century, habits became entrenched. When entering into marriage, the size of the dowry, rights to property, living in the husband's house, penalties for elopement, and now also the amount of the contribution to the policy were discussed. Notaries knew that any attempt to put the town hall seal on such papers would result in a dispute with the magistrate. The city charter did not recognize insurance for events that could not be objectively verified. The broker understood this and circumvented the charter. He did not try to give the policy the status of a public document. He sold a private contract, assuring families through intermediaries that this was sufficient. In the city baths, where the statutes of the Bathhouse Guild allowed conversations about health and family matters, the word protection often came up. The paradox was that protection was measured in coins, not in the guarantee of a fair procedure. The investigation began with a trifle. In the penalty book for the year when the neighboring valley suffered a crop failure and the city suffered from high bread prices, the clerk found an entry stating that a merchant had been fined for slandering his wife. The amount was small because the family had negotiated through intermediaries. The note read, "Claim for compensation through a private agreement not satisfied." The expression was repeated several more times in different years. There was not a single note saying, "Payment in full." Some had their expenses for changes in the dowry covered. A small part? Some were paid coins in honor, slightly more than the fee for a notarial record. This meant that the dusty paper shown in the shops was in reality worthless. The clerk, a man from the service class of townspeople who had sworn an oath to the magistrate, opened the register where guarantors and intermediaries were recorded and saw the familiar name of the broker, next to it, the surnames of the experts. The thread led to a neighborhood where offices for assessing damage from fires and highway robberies were located. That assessment was subject to rules: inspection by 2 guild masters, stamped paper, registration with the senior officer. Here, instead of real masters and elders, there were respectable witnesses appointed by those who set the fees. The economy of the body was turning into an economy of wording. Those who were paid for it were declared disgraced. The city books contained decrees on combating counterfeit measures and weights, on the duties of notaries, and on the powers of guilds. There are also lines regulating marriage contracts, the requirement of 2 witnesses when agreeing on a dowry, the possibility of arbitration in disputes over property, and the wife's right to personal items specified in a box. There is not a single decree in which the integrity of the body is recognized as an insurance risk. Church teachings listed sins, but did not assess them in monetary terms. Medical treatises that came through university towns talked about healthy practices, but did not provide tools for recording the events that were whispered about. The clerk gathered these papers, put them together, and saw a simple picture. The myth promised financial protection of honor, while the document showed insurance of the uninsurable. When the broker sent out promises through acquaintances during the next wedding contract season, a line of new clients from the artisan elite formed. During the same period, an expert with neat hands appeared in the guild pharmacist's shop, offering consultations on women's health and issuing letters with phrases about integrity worthy of respect. The apothecary, a cautious man, noted that the consultant did not have a university degree, but the latter had letters from merchants praising his discernment, and one letter with the seal of the parish trustee, attesting to his good faith in charitable matters. These letters looked convincing until their dates were checked against the penalty books. The testimonials appeared precisely when the broker received another payment, and then the refusals to pay began, based on far-fetched wording. The first twist became apparent when the clerk visited the neighboring parish to see the rector, who was listed among the experts' references. In the parish books for that year, the rector was away. The letters of recommendation were signed by his assistant. The entry about the issuance of the letter of commendation coincided with the entry about a donation for roof repairs made by the same intermediary who brought clients to the broker. It turned out that the expert and his supporting persons were part of the same chain. They were considered respectable because they had built a facade of charity and exemplary family behavior around themselves, but in reality, they lived on commissions. In the documents, their honor was built on paper figures, commendations and recommendations that were written in exchange for donations. Craftsmen who believed in order took this as a sign of reliability. The second twist came when one family tried to put the policy into practice. The groom, having gathered rumors, refused to continue with the marriage and demanded a review of the dowry, citing unproven but persistently repeated words from neighbors. The bride's family presented the contract and the contributions made on time, referred to an insured event, and applied to the broker for payment. The broker appointed experts. They came, examined the boxes of linen, counted the linen, talked to the housekeepers, and left, leaving a paper with words about the difficulty of establishing the event and the insufficiency of indirect evidence, after which they recommended partial consolation. The amount was negligible. When the wife's father threatened to take the matter to court, the broker sent word through intermediaries that such action would be considered slander against the good name of the intermediary, and that he would take the matter to court. Thus, insurance turned into a threat of adverse action. By paying for protection, the family became bound by a network of letters of recommendation and risked being fined for trying to get what was theirs. The third twist arose from medical practice. The city had bath attendants whose charter stipulated that they must swear to keep their clients' secrets, not ask questions about family matters, and not issue certificates unrelated to health confirmed by visible ulcers and fevers. The brokers' experts circumvented this rule. They positioned themselves not as bath attendants or university doctors, but as discerning, kind people, obliged to protect honor. Their papers were rarely challenged publicly because no one wanted to embarrass the parishes. But the clerk found a complaint from the bathhouse in the archives. 2 masters with familiar surnames were taken away from the bath attendants. They went to the broker, who promised higher rewards for written conclusions. This was a direct threat to the rule of law. The guilds were losing control, and the right to examine and testify in health matters was in the hands of people whose signatures depended on commissions. While the broker's network was spreading, the magistrate was already facing indirect consequences. Quick divorces, in disputes over dowries, became more frequent in the city. The groom's relatives referred to irreparable loss of honor, although there were no public authority documents confirming this indisputable fact. Private papers carried weight in a narrow circle, but were not equal to stamped deeds. The clerk prepared a report comparing statutes and contracts. In one column were city ordinances on marriage contracts and guardianship. In the other were honesty policies. The difference was obvious. The register of items for which compensation could be claimed in the statutes was limited to material objects and money. Honor did not appear as an insured object. He attached a table with examples, indicating the years, surnames, and place names within city districts, avoiding the private names of young spouses so as not to cause a stir. The result looked less like a sensation and more like quiet accounting. Each case was an underpayment. Each conclusion was a dependent expert. The threat of libel suits became the broker's main tactic. The intermediary did not speak publicly. His representatives sent letters through notaries, mentioning conversations that discredit the house and honor, hinting at insults to young women, and demanding to stop spreading harmful judgments before the magistrate. It worked. Craftsmen were not accustomed to lawsuits against people who were praised in their parishes. But the magistrate did not have the luxury of remaining silent. If the city's laws on weights and measures protect buyers from fraud, why not protect families from false promises? The clerk did not bring charges, but rather presented a list of procedural questions. Copies of his notes clarify the logic. What document confirms an insured event? What public authority recognizes an event if it is by its very nature unverifiable? What guild charter gives authority to the people who sign the conclusions? At the bottom of each note are lines with statutes. The Bathhouse Guild does not grant. The Doctors' Guild requires a university degree. The Notaries' Guild prohibits the execution of contracts based on conditions that cannot be verified. Myth gave way to paper in every cell of the table. At the same time, he collected economic figures, all in writing, as required by the rules. Over 5 years, at least 2,000 coins of total contributions passed through the hands of the intermediary. During the same period, according to independent sources, consolations were issued in an amount not exceeding 200. Full payments, 0. Only documented cases were included in the calculation, because verbal settlements were excluded by definition. These figures stifled the conversation. Believers in the good mission of the policy were forced to admit that it was a tool for converting contributions into commissions. When the inspector from the central government returned to the city with news of new taxes on salt and new instructions for city courts, the magistrates seized the moment. Discussing the emperor's latest decree on the procedure for registering contracts, the judges compared local practices with general requirements. The decision was pragmatic and drastic: to ban any private policies where the event could not be validated by the city authorities or guild masters, to invalidate contracts in which persons without the appropriate statutory title acted as experts, to instruct notaries not to draw up or keep such papers, require the intermediary to return premiums for years in which there were no legally recognized insurance claims. This decree was not a moral victory, but an administrative operation. The broker's seals were confiscated, the books were checked, and part of the money was returned. The story did not end with a single decision. Families who had lost part of their dowry due to quick terminations entered the magistrate's office with requests to take the damage into account. The court could not award compensation based on rumors, but it could return illegally withheld contributions. The broker's house called it an attack on commercial freedom. In response, the clerk slipped the judges copies of the statutes on bill of exchange cases, which stated that free trade was only possible if the subject of the transaction was clear. Honor, by their definition, is not a subject of trade. This thesis was enshrined in a few words in the decision, and in this language it became understandable to any shopkeeper. Despite the dryness of the paper, human pain could be seen behind it. Girls who became wives in an economy that turned the body inside out were deprived not only of the right to protection, but also of the opportunity to speak without fear of being accused of slander. Men who wanted to save face in their families were deprived of money and the confidence that there was a clear law in the city. Everyone was deprived of time. The church teachings, which kept track of sins in that era, did not set monetary rates. The doctoral treatises, which described women's ailments by season, did not provide the tools to confirm private events. The broker filled the void between fear and law. But the void did not become law just because a seal was stamped on it. The clerk left a note in his notebook without any moralizing. It describes how, in a city where people know how to calculate profit and loss, they have come up with contracts that ensure not what can be measured, but what can be imposed. In the same notebook, written in a hand accustomed to formal language, it was noted that the magistrate had returned the premiums and banned policies where the outcome depended on the word of the intermediary's experts. There are no names, only years, acts, and statutes. These dry lines are disturbing because they describe not a random act of meanness, but a structured institution of control. In this institution, the body became the cornerstone of credit, and credit became the door to a house where strangers made decisions. Thus closed the shop of promises, written on parchment with beautiful headings. But the city did not forget. Too many weddings had paid for protection that turned out to be a rope around their wrists. At the end of the reference, two columns are stitched together: myth and document. The first contained the phrase financial protection of honor, and the second contained the magistrate's resolution on ensuring the uninsurable. Between the columns lay the entire difference between the verandas of houses, where rumors were whispered, and the stone steps of the town hall, where lines were counted and seals were affixed. And if there is a lesson to be learned from this story, it is not in the words of preachers or the buzz of the markets, but in the simple movement of the clerk's hand, who put the papers in the right order and showed that behind the showcase of modernity sometimes lies an old account of trust. Further on, it was necessary to deal not with beautiful words, but with protocols, where each line was like a stitch on a scar. In the city books, one can trace how the mediator tried to gain a foothold in the usual institutions. He made donations for the repair of the chapel, paid for candles for the altar, and financed the guard during the autumn fairs. This is how a shell of trustworthiness was created. But the same books of fines showed the opposite: an increase in petty lawsuits over honor, an intensification of disputes over dowries, and an increase in the number of intermediary fees for settlements without publicity. In the shops, people talked about calm and predictability, but in the registers, there were more and more references to houses on the verge of scandal, where every word had to be paid for. The clerk did not invest any morality in this. He simply stacked sheet after sheet and saw how novelty grew into a system. An unpleasant detail came to light when the magistrate ordered the seals on the experts' letters of recommendation to be checked. Strict rules were in force in the city. The charter of the Bathhouse Guild was one thing, the procedure for medical certificates was another, and the powers of notaries were separately specified. The seals of parishes and brotherhoods had to be recorded in a separate book. Upon verification, it turned out that some of the wax impressions were cast with fresh sealing wax from the same matrix, although according to the documents, the letters came from different neighborhoods and even neighboring parishes. What was accepted as a wide circle of trust turned out to be the work of one person. The clerk noted this as a contradiction, and the mediator, through his attorneys, began to persuade the elders not to publicize the matter, reminding them of their donations. In response, the guild elder of the bathhouse workers, a man who was not soft-hearted but obliging, raised his own books. The two masters who had gone to the experts had the right to examine only within the bathhouse, and only for health reasons, confirmed by obvious signs of illness. Their signatures under the events of honor contradicted the guild's charter. The expert network was cracking at the seams in the very place where it was supposed to look flawless. Things got even more alarming. A draft contract was found in the town hall archives, in which an intermediary offered a merchant house reinsurance of honor risks with a third party in a neighboring town. The paper did not have time to receive a seal, but there were pencil notes in the margins, commission calculations, a share for bringing in clients, interest for hidden checks. According to the accounts, the family paid a premium once a year. The intermediary took his share immediately. The experts received a fee for each referral, and the reinsurer paid nothing by definition, because he did not recognize the event as legal. The scheme was designed so that the money flowed upwards and only came back down in the form of charitable candles and small consolations. When the clerk compared these calculations with a series of refusals, a neat table of dependencies emerged. The louder the family tried to get paid, the more often threats of libel suits appeared, and the more tangible the risk to the family itself became. Not monetary, but reputational. Objection to the policy turned into an attack on the parish. The trouble in this story had a material form: chests with dowries, lists of fabrics, dishes, and linen, keys kept by the girl who became a wife, and shares of the shop's income. All of this was subject to accounting and dispute in court. What was not subject to accounting was what the broker turned into a commodity: the idea that an event that cannot be publicly verified can be the subject of monetary compensation. In the cities of the empire, they knew how to insure against fire. Merchant warehouses did burn. Neighbors saw it, measured the traces, and assessed the loss by measure and weight. They knew how to insure against highway robbery. A caravan arrived without some of its bales. Witnesses recorded this, and the guards and the court got involved. But here, the intermediary transferred the logic of fires to a sphere where it is impossible to bring a charred beam or a torn bale to court. The clerk recorded this dryly: event invalid, and next to it, policy is inadmissible. By this time, a second expert had become a familiar figure in the city. A man who had served as a clerk in a moneylender's office in previous years, and knew how to draw up payment schedules. He had no connection with either the Bathhouse Guild or medical practice, but he was distinguished by his quick wit and precise wording. It was he who introduced into circulation a set of phrases about integrity worthy of respect, indirect signs of disgrace, and incomplete proof of the event, which made it possible to refuse almost always. His letters bore the seals of trust of large houses. These houses were admired for their rich caravans and financing of the city wall. It seems that their support is proof in itself. But the magistrate's account book had a different logic. Trust in capital does not turn private opinion into a legal basis. Families, tired of threats and humiliation, began to bring their chests of papers to the town hall. Among these papers were several strange receipts. Grooms signed commitments to refrain from defamatory rumors in exchange for a discount on the dowry, and the mediator acted as a guarantor of mutual silence. This was another twist. The policy, sold as protection, actually functioned as a mechanism for buying silence. In one case, I saw how the wife's father, a man of diligence and faith in order, collected 3 expert testimonies, paid commissions for each, and as a result, received only a paper stating the existence of disagreements and a recommendation to proceed to a domestic settlement. The money went to commissions, silence was bought, and legal certainty was absent. In the family's expense book, kept by a meticulous housekeeper, there were lines about savings on winter firewood due to these payments. Dry numbers turned into cold in the house. When the pressure reached its limit, the magistrate brought the case to a procedural level. He ordered the guild elders to be questioned about the admissibility of issuing conclusions outside their statutes. The Bathhouse Guild responded by referring to the rules: client confidentiality, no right to issue letters not related to obvious illnesses. The Doctors' Guild referred to university privileges and reminded that those who do not have a degree cannot call their papers certificates. The Notaries' Guild pointed to the prohibition on stamping private contracts based on conditions that could not be verified by the city authorities or guildmasters. Thus, 3 independent institutions, each jealous of its powers, said the same thing, without rhetoric or loud words. It was a rare chorus of agreement for the city. Feeling threatened, the mediator resorted to his usual weapon, fear of the court. Through his attorneys, he began sending out notices of contempt of the parish and damage to the good name of young ladies, hinting that anyone who criticized the policy was allegedly attacking the honor of women. It was cynical and effective. No one wanted to be suspected of rudeness. In response, the clerk prepared a new report that did not contain a single name from private life. There were only statutes, procedural rules, and payment facts. On the last page, he gave an example from the city's practice of insuring warehouses. There was a 3-step validation process: inspection by 2 masters with stamped rights, a guard report, and registration of damage with the foreman. He pointed out that none of these links were present in the policies of honor and could not be. The comparison proved more convincing than any sermon. By this point, part of the clergy had sided with the procedure. Parish instructions had long contained reminders about the reciprocity of marital obligations and the inadmissibility of coercion. Priests did not interfere in commercial disputes, but it was unbearable for them to see religious words being used as a commodity label. Several abbots, whose names were not made public, sent notes to the magistrate asking him to put an end to practices that turned conscience and penitential conversation into confirmation of insurance claims. These notes became the 3rd turning point. The moral basis on which the mediator relied ceased to work even in the eyes of people close to the altar. And again, the decisive argument was not lofty ideals, but order. The parish has no authority to certify commercial contracts, which means that its seal in such matters is an abuse of the trust of parishioners. Meanwhile, The city's economy was going through its own cycles. During one of the summer seasons, there was a salt shortage, prices jumped, and small shops were in turmoil. It is at such moments that unnecessary expenses become apparent. Families who had paid for the protection of honor began to ask accountants direct questions about the usefulness of their contributions. In the shop where the merchant's widow kept the accounts, a column labeled "Useless" appeared, in which she entered all payments that did not bring tangible results. In addition to luxury, this column included two items: ostentatious excesses and policies of honesty. The widow did not read treatises and did not like big words. She simply counted money while dealing with the worries of winter. When there were several such widows, the magistrate received what no reform lacks: a social demand for clear rules. The decision that was reached seemed dry and even formal, but that was the point. The magistrate invalidated contracts whose subject matter could not be validated by the city authorities or statutory masters, prohibited notaries from keeping and certifying such papers, obliged the intermediary to return contributions for years in which there were no legally recognized insurance cases, and ordered the guilds to stop their members from issuing any conclusions outside the scope of their statutes. No high-profile executions, no show trials. Just a protocol where every line fits into existing norms. The broker tried to challenge it, appealing to the freedom of private contract, but city freedom implied clarity of the subject of the transaction, and here there was no subject. The returns began with lengthy checks. In the magistrate's office, boxes with lists of contributions were assembled, checked against notaries' books, and family attorneys were invited. It turned out that some of the payments had gone through third parties, the very experts who took a commission for bringing in clients. These people disappeared from the city as quickly as they had appeared. Some left under the guise of pilgrimage. Others slipped away at the winter fair without paying for their lodging. Several returned with pleas for forgiveness due to poverty. The court did not prosecute them criminally because they had not committed a crime in the formal sense. They had signed letters of opinion. But the court did not allow them to keep what they had earned from other people's anxiety. Only part of the money was recovered from the sealed chests and property. The rest was lost in donations, gifts to the guards, and advantageous marriages with relatives of the intermediary. It seemed like the final outcome, but there is a shadow in any such story. It is filled with speculation, like water in basements. People who were accustomed to measuring honor with coins did not immediately give up the habit. For some time, private receipts for good name continued to circulate in the city, no longer passed off as insurance policies, but offered as letters of guarantee for marriage negotiations. The difference was subtle and dangerous. The magistrate could not prohibit private individuals from exchanging character assessments, but he could continue to prohibit the conversion of these assessments into monetary commodities. The clerk, having finished the main case, started a new folder where he stored such receipts, marking them as papers without legal force. He understood the obvious. Control institutions like to change their name and continue their old business under a new name. Therefore, he meticulously attached the previous statutes to each new paper, as if applying a cold compress to a wound to prevent it from festering. In the same year, when the city returned part of the contributions and stopped issuing fictitious expert opinions, the hospital almshouse under the management of the city trustee noted an unexpected consequence. Women stopped coming with requests for letters of protection and began to ask more often for forms for official complaints about coercion by relatives. These complaints did not turn into spectacular cases, and that was right. They were considered in closed rooms with the participation of 2 judges and 1 experienced mentor from the women's charity. The outcome of such proceedings was rarely dramatic, but almost always led to one of 2 results. Either the relatives were ordered not to exert pressure under threat of a fine, or the families agreed on a new arrangement for property and residence that removed the reason for blackmail. Thus, replacing a fictitious policy with a real procedure ceased to be an abstraction and became a concrete form of protection. Meanwhile, the experts of the old intermediary, deprived of their easy earnings, tried to find work in neighboring towns, offering the same services as moral counseling. They managed to survive for several months in some places, but news of their methods spread faster than wagons and caravans. Guild elders began to exchange copies of the city's decision to ban policies with invalid events. This document became a model precisely because it was not about morals or feelings, but about verifiability. It did not contain a single word about virtue or vice, only lists. Who has the right to issue conclusions? What facts are subject to public verification? What transactions are considered null and void? The chancelleries loved such texts for their suitability as attachments to a request, to a complaint, to a bill of exchange. The clerk, who began the story with a note in the penalty book, ended up doing exactly what a person of his profession should do. He closed the folder, looked up at the wall where the lists of magistrates from previous years hung, and added another line to the register. The circulation of the new currency to the Control Institute has been suspended by decree. This line did not inspire enthusiasm, but it gave a sense of the density of time. The city did not become better or cleaner. It simply stopped paying for the promise to protect what could not be verified. In the language of the office, it sounded dry, like January frost. In the language of the human home, it meant that there were slightly more linen sheets in the chests, slightly more bread on the tables, and slightly more firewood for the winter. There is no room for sensation in such arithmetic, but there is room for life, which continues when empty seals are put away in a box and statutes are returned to their place. But even when it seemed that the mechanism had been dismantled and the gears laid out on the table, the inertia of habit took over. As in the old days, family unions began weddings with lists of property and promises of order in the house, and these lists still had empty columns where the annual fee for paper protection used to be entered. These empty spaces began to be filled with new substitutes: fraternal recommendations, guarantees from neighbors, moral letters from respected ladies of charitable societies. At first glance, this seemed gentler than before, without contributions and interest rates, but the logic remained the same. They tried to put honor into circulation in order to dispose of it according to the rules of the transaction. The clerk, who had memorized the language of the statutes, saw how the old ways were trying to return through respectable doors, and watched as patiently as they count sacks of grain on the city tower in autumn. Family archives, accustomed to storing marriage contracts alongside promissory notes and receipts for shops, now began to bring notebooks to the office where they kept a home register of grievances. They listed gossip, suspicions, notes about family quarrels, and sometimes notes about visits to the priest or the workshop foreman. People believed that meticulous record-keeping would save them from injustice. But record-keeping without legal procedure gave rise to a new market of influence. Former attorneys of the mediator who held the policies entered this market. Now they called themselves guardians of harmony and offered appeasing schedules in which one party undertook not to raise certain topics at family meetings and the other not to reduce the dowry when it was reviewed. The papers looked innocent until the magistrate compared them to the city's mediation statute. Any agreement affecting property had to be registered or at least signed by a notary. Otherwise, it was considered null and void. The guardians of consent avoided registration because it opened the door to judicial review, and they needed a gray area where the winner was whoever held the most other people's notebooks in their hands. This is how a new shadow of the old control appeared. Not a policy, but a buffer letter, which was based not on norms, but on a habit of administrative blackmail. In a city where every craft had its own tools, legal instruments were also subject to verification. The magistrate ordered a procedure that was rare for those years: selective reading of home registers, with the consent of families who had recently undergone marriage negotiations. They did not read about private life, but about the circulation of papers: who brought them, who certified them, who insisted on them. The reading revealed a map of influence, similar to a diagram of water flow after a summer rainstorm. The papers flowed into the same hands that had previously held the network of experts. Instead of paid conclusions, there were free, friendly recommendations. Instead of an annual fee, there were obligations not to make a fuss. The fairness lay in the fact that these recommenders could no longer collect money under contract. The danger lay in the fact that they continued to convert trust into power, and power into access to other people's decisions. The clerk noted this dryly in a memo: transfer of a fictitious guarantee to the realm of custom. Next, it was necessary to turn to the experience of those institutions that had earned the city's trust precisely through their procedures. The Guild of Sea Goods Traders had long had a procedure for dealing with disputed salt deliveries: 3 consecutive steps: inspection of the scales at the suppliers, control measurement at the recipients, and recording by the foreman. Mistakes happened, but the rules were as solid as stone steps. These steps laid the foundation for a new shift. The magistrate proposed a simple rule: any moral guarantees relating to marriage negotiations and dowries are valid only insofar as they relate to property and money, and only after registration with a notary. Anything relating to good names cannot be the subject of a written obligation under any circumstances. The rule was short and seemed obvious, but it was pronounced as law for the first time. Thus, the myth that honor can be put on paper and traded away was once again refuted by a document that specified which things are subject to trade and which are not. Not everyone liked this. Some of the older bourgeois families were accustomed to relying on the invisible wall of reputation that they had built up over the years through donations and participation in charitable foundations. For them, the rejection of letters of guarantee seemed like an attack on the instrument of managing family alliances. In response, they tried to raise the old argument about freedom of private contract. The clerk prepared a comparative report for the magistrate. In the freedom column, he listed the forms of agreements recognized by the city: sale and purchase, loan, hire, bill of exchange, surety. In the prohibition column, transactions without a subject, agreements based on events that are not subject to public verification, and any attempts to impose property consequences on the possession of a good name. At the bottom of the reference was a remarkable formula: freedom of contract exists where there is measurability and an understandable side of risk, and ceases to exist where human dignity is made the subject. This formula was then copied into the notebooks of notary apprentices and posted in the town hall school for city clerks. While these papers were being compiled, winter arrived with unusually long winds. During such months, the city listens to the sounds through the doors: how the snow crunches under the watchman's feet, how the well rope hums, how conversations swirl in warm rooms. On one such night, a complaint was placed on the clerk's desk, neatly written, without names or addresses. An anonymous receipt has found its way into the family, promising peace in exchange for silence about old grievances. Attached to the complaint was a sheet of paper with neat curls. The text had been typed by the mediator's former acquaintances. It was an old trick with a new name. The magistrate accepted the complaint for review, and the review was conducted according to the rules of a closed room, without spectators, with the mandatory participation of a notary and the head of the relevant guild, since the subject did not concern good names, but the division of property and the dowry. In the end, a concise decision was made. The receipt is invalid. The division of property shall be carried out in accordance with the marriage contract. The parties shall refrain from exchanging documents whose subject matter is not subject to accounting. This ruling was later applied to similar complaints as a model, and the paper, bearing the wax seals of the former guardians of harmony, was placed in a box labeled Invalid Forms. Meanwhile, new questions began to arise at the City Hospital Almshouse, where people came not for words but for help. Women who had become wives in a year without insurance policies asked not about letters of honor, but about how to specify in the marriage contract the things that would remain their personal property under any circumstances. The almshouse, which had the right to give advice only within the limits of charity, referred them to notaries. Notaries, trained by the latest regulations, willingly included in contracts detailed lists of boxes, clothes, handicraft tools, and even books if they constituted a personal library. It seemed like a trifle, but it was precisely such trifles that proved to be stronger than any letters of guarantee. An item entered in the register remained with the person who brought it into the house. A box of needles ultimately provided better protection than a receipt for peace in the family. This is the economic part of the new practice. Instead of fictitious insurance for the uninsurable, there was a detailed inventory of what was subject to accounting, dispute, and protection. Neighboring cities reacted differently to the innovation. Some limited themselves to verbal recommendations, while others requested copies of decisions. The clerk helped send out lists via couriers, attaching brief excerpts, a list of prohibited forms of insurance of honor, an excerpt from the statute on the inadmissibility of contracts outside the guilds, and samples of correct marriage clauses on personal property. Thus, the document became customary, and this custom began to hinder attempts to return the policy or its substitutes. Meanwhile, the old intermediary, having lost his main source of income, tried to find a place in other businesses. He offered mediation in protracted disputes over transportation through swampy areas and tried to get a share in soap production under the guise of an ash supplier. But a reputation built on commissions based on trust does not fare well with hard objects. He had to trade cautiously, hide his past, and yet his name sometimes appeared in the books of the elders, in cases where cunning was required, but the seal of the guild was not. At the same time, there was something that could not be measured by the weight of a seal, but could be noted in a school notebook. A few years after the ban on policies, the number of cases of slander against women decreased, and where they did occur, the courts more often imposed fines for attempts to exert pressure through public opinion, rather than for insulting honor. The distribution of time in the town hall changed. Instead of endless meetings on meaningless cases, there were more discussions of property disputes, where the court could sum up the results in weights, lengths, and coins. The guards were less distracted by moral raids on the homes of the bourgeoisie and spent more time visiting warehouses and markets. In other words, the city began to expend its energy where it was effective, rather than where force was replaced by appearances. And yet, in the farthest corners of tradition, there are always people ready to hang the old sign on a new hook. One autumn, a wandering scribe appeared at the fairground, offering letters to appease relatives. He did not talk about honor. He wrote about good manners and mutual respect. His texts had no legal force, but they were pleasing to the eye. Crowds easily gathered around such sheets, especially when there were many visitors in the city, and everyone was looking for a quick sign of reliability. The magistrate did not pursue the matter further, as this would have led to a turning point where a slight push would have been enough. He posted a short notice at the entrances to the town hall. The city recognizes the validity of only those documents in which the subject of the transaction is subject to accounting, measurement, and verification. Any letters about the character of individuals are not grounds for property transactions. Thus, The document once again preempted the myth, not with a shout, but with a sign on the door that everyone would have to pass through anyway. Meanwhile, the clerk's house was filling up with gray folders. One contained receipts for returned contributions. Another contained extracts from marriage contracts with detailed lists of personal belongings. And a third contained copies of decisions invalidating moral receipts. He looked through them in the evenings, like a watchman inspecting the yard after a snowfall, and knew that the most important thing in these papers was not the loudness of the words, but the repetitiveness of the actions. Repetition creates habit. Habit creates norm. Norm creates protection. It's a boring ladder, but it's the one that holds up the roof. On one of the sheets, he made a note that sounded almost like a chronicle. The transfer of fear into accounting is complete. Attempts to turn accounting back into fear have been suppressed by the norm. This note was not shown to anyone, but the city air became a little warmer because of it. The following years brought new challenges. Roads were sometimes covered with bandits, sometimes died out due to the salt tax, and sometimes came back to life with caravans carrying fabrics. Each such surge tested the strength of the newly established rules, and each time they held because people learned to explain them simply. Notaries, drawing up marriage contracts, willingly repeated a short formula. List what can be taken into account. Argue about what can be weighed. Do not sign promises that cannot be verified. Priests, instructing young spouses, reminded them of reciprocity, but added that reciprocity is not insured but develops in life. Guild elders, resolving disputes, referred to the same sign on the town hall door. Thus, the habit of empty guarantees lost its weight and became an echo of the past. But what about those who had already lost? Some families were left with scars, reduced dowries, damaged relationships with relatives, and debts that took years to pay off. The magistrate could not rewrite the past, but he could establish a modest practice of late verification when notebooks with home registers were brought to the office and clerks helped rewrite some of the entries into the language of current law. As a result, debt notes based on moral receipts were declared invalid, and property registers led to the return of items that had been withheld without legal grounds. No big deal, just clothes back in chests, tools back on sewing tables, books back on shelves. By the standards of the Chronicles, these are trifles, but by the standards of the home, they are a relief comparable to the first thaw. Somewhere during this period, an old mediator, who had aged faster than his years, tried to approach a new topic: letters of trust about the reliability of merchants. He figured that if a woman's honor was no longer for sale, then trust in the shop could be sold. But this sector had long been governed by rigid forms, guarantees and promissory notes. Numbers, deadlines, and seals already reigned supreme there, leaving no room for the old tricks. His names disappeared from the records, dissolving into notes about minor services and unsuccessful deals. The silence surrounding such an ending was not an act of mercy. It was simply that routine, which does not tolerate artists well, had replaced the hustle and bustle of his network. Late one evening, the clerk lingered in the empty office, reviewing references requested by a neighboring town. The shadow of the clock tower fell across the window, and he jotted down a concise line in his notebook. The document maintained balance where myth demanded tribute. It was not a victory cry. It was knowledge of a craft similar to carpentry. If the beams are laid correctly and in the right order, the house will survive the wind, the winter, and the heat from the stoves. And if someone comes later and offers to sell the air under the roof, the clerk will have a short phrase on stamped paper that is cheaper than any promise and stronger than any sign. Gradually, it became clear that a single prohibition was not enough to ensure the stability of the new order. A habit of verification was required, almost as craft-like as the daily sharpening of a knife on a whetstone. Therefore, the magistrate expanded the practice of quiet checks. In every dispute over marital property, the clerks took out previous decisions as samples, and in every case of an attempt to slip in a moral receipt, they stamped it invalid and attached it to the case file so that no attorney could refer to it as a precedent in the future. Thus, a new network was formed. Not a network of people, but a network of procedures. It did not require big names, only discipline, and it was this discipline that became the supporting beam that is not conspicuous, but holds the house together. At city auctions, this was expressed in a simple gesture. When families discussed a union, instead of vague assurances about good name, they laid out on the table a copy of the marriage contract with a register of personal belongings, a list of mutual obligations regarding the home, and a list of conditions for living and spending the dowry. In addition, notaries began to include a clause prohibiting the transfer of any letters of character to third parties as a basis for property decisions. At first, large houses snorted as if they were being forced to learn literacy all over again. But soon, they appreciated the clarity of the accounts. The contract was no longer dependent on gossip, and each new union strengthened the predictability of trade. Where intermediaries had previously rustled in the shadows, now the scratching of pens could be heard, drawing up lists of cloth, dishes, tools, shares in the shop, and shares in the income from the caravans. And yet, habits have long roots. On the outskirts of the city, closer to the tanners' workshops and resin warehouses, relatives remained who, out of old habit, liked to resolve doubts with a third word, the opinion of a respected person. In these neighborhoods, former assistants to the mediator developed a new trick, the witness sheet of good neighbors. The sheet looked like the minutes of a meeting of families with the participation of two witnesses of the neighborhood, respectable people from the neighborhood. It stated that the parties confirmed their respect and recognized peace. At the end, a line was added stating that in the event of a breach of peace, one party had the right to demand compensation for defamation, without specifying the amount or referring to any verification authorities. The paper was not called a policy, but it repeated its complaint. It introduced a monetary consequence into an area that was not subject to public scrutiny. The clerk noticed the repetition of the wording and ordered a selective check of the signatures of the witnesses from the community. It turned out that in half of the cases, the same people who had previously written conclusions at the broker's request were involved, and in the other half, people who were indebted to them for previous services of peace. This was the fourth twist, an attempt to restore the instrument through community authority. The response again came not with thunder, but with carving along the edge. The magistrate adopted a brief act. Any witness statements would be taken into account only insofar as they described facts that could be verified in material terms, and any threats of compensation for defamation, not linked to material obligations, would be declared null and void. The act was accompanied by instructions for neighborhood elders. A respected person is not a position, and therefore any signatures without guild or city authority cannot become a bucket scooping coins from someone else's chest. The elders hung these instructions on the doors of their tents next to the tables of fines for being late for night watch and dirt on the benches. The paper looked mundane, but it worked where the small things worked, at the entrance, in plain sight, at eye level. During this period, the City School for Scribes, which trained future notaries and clerks, updated its course on forms of transactions. A section on non-valid events appeared, where examples were used to explain why fire and robbery are insurable, but marital disgrace is not. Why a guarantee for a debt is subject to accounting, but a guarantee for good character is not. Why silence agreements are devoid of subject matter and fall apart at the first contact with the judge's bench. The textbooks were dry, but they reflected recent cases No names, no drama, just logic. Graduates of this school then took up positions in notary offices, city chancelleries of neighboring towns, and guild offices, and with them spread the habit of checking not words, but verification conditions. This solved the main hidden question: how to ensure that memory did not depend on the charisma of a single clerk and a single group of magistrates. The answer was the habit of breaking down myths into points and imposing them on statutory grids. A separate layer was the restructuring of church practices. Parish instructions began to emphasize more often the reciprocity of marital obligations and the inadmissibility of coercion, but without interfering in property matters. The rectors emphasized that property issues were resolved in the town hall and spiritual issues in confession, and that it was dangerous to mix them up. Some charitable brotherhoods introduced an internal rule not to issue any notes that could be interpreted as settling accounts in property matters, and to redirect any questions about divisions to notary offices. This was an important turning point, because the previous system was fueled precisely by the blurring of the boundaries between moral support and commercial consequences. Now, the boundary became visible and, most importantly, repeated in identical wording from neighborhood to neighborhood. Against the backdrop of internal restructuring, the city was also experiencing external upheavals. One year brought a strange spring with prolonged rains, and the salt caravans were weeks late. Another year, the roads were bustling with orders for fabric from the court, and the merchants' shops were changing their accounts at lightning speed. In the third, the local garrison increased its demands on suppliers, and the city began to talk about new taxes. It is in such years that accelerators and circumventors are most likely to seep in. They were recognizable by their identical gestures. Let's return to the simplified letter of good manners, so as not to waste time on notarial registers. But trade, taught by past losses, already knew the price of simplicity without a seal. One after another, merchants' offices began to demand from related houses clearly formulated clauses on personal belongings and clear contractual lines on the right to residence and profit shares. This market discipline underpinned the new norms more strongly than any decree, because in it the accounts were settled or disagreed immediately, without intermediaries, consolers. Meanwhile, a case arrived at the clerk's office that combined almost all of the mechanisms found earlier. A family from the tanning quarter had formed an alliance with a house of salt suppliers. The negotiations were difficult. The senior tanners insisted on the good name of the bride, while the suppliers demanded a list of items and clear obligations. The former assistants of the mediator proposed a peace agreement in which they promised to smooth things over in exchange for mutual recognition. The sheet was inserted into the contract as an unstamped insert and carried with it the threat of returning the monetary leverage to the realm of the invalid. The notary, who had happened to study for a couple of years under the very same clerk, refused to record the insert and wrote a simple formula in large letters in the margins. The subject does not exist. Verification is impossible. The promise is insignificant. According to city rules, the dispute went into a closed room. There, the elders of the houses, too proud to negotiate in the presence of third parties, were forced to compare the lists of items with the blank sheet of peace. Then arithmetic decided everything. The tanners had registers of hides, tools, and shares in the workshop. The suppliers had knowledge of roads and warehouses, and the peace sheet had only text. The sheet reinforced its own meaninglessness by its very presence, and it was filed away in the invalid folder. The union was formed on the basis of property and shares, not on the threat of buying silence. The clerk marked this case as an exemplary case without ostentation. Occasionally, news of disruptions came from neighboring towns, where magistrates did not pay attention to myths of honor, retreating into convenient silence. Policies of honesty returned under the guise of good old customs. These stories usually ended the same way. Several years of collections, not a single full payment, threats of libel suits against those who tried to demand what was theirs. Sometimes there was a very dark note. The police intervened with morality checks in the homes of the bourgeoisie, from where donations in order flowed much more often. Our city, having learned its lesson, sent copies of its acts and brief recommendations in response, which contained no moralizing, only mechanics. List the items to be checked. Prohibit any monetary consequences for invalid events. Separate church instructions and property procedures. Introduce standard clauses on personal belongings at notaries. Where these 4 lines became parallel, the slippage stopped, as if the sand in the wells had ceased to be stolen by the bagful. On a human level, changes always look less impressive than on stamped paper. But that is where their stability lies. There were fewer whispered gatherings in city homes, where elders demanded papers of honor. There was more accounting. Families kept expense notebooks, where they no longer recorded contributions for protection, and noticed that what they saved in 3 lines was enough for the winter without loans. In marital disputes, instead of threats of offended good manners, the issue of rights to a chest, fabric, or a machine often came up. In shops, where expert recommendations were previously readily accepted, they were now viewed as weather forecasts. Interesting, but with no impact on the bill. And in this everyday dryness lay the main protection. Protection from people who were used to making money on the fear of other people's words. The old mediator, who once held the strings, spent his last years trying to squeeze into any cracks. He went to the tar workshop, offering to settle odors with neighboring yards. He tried to sell advice on the order of Q when issuing salt, and once even brought a petition to the office, asking for permission to open a family counseling office, where he promised to harmonize. The petition was left unanswered. The subject was unclear, there was no authority, and there was no way to verify it. He left quietly, as people who have lost the language of their craft leave. In other chronicles, such people are written about either maliciously or pityingly. In this story, there is neither, only a neat shelf with files, where his signature is repeated like a trace that was used to dismantle the mechanism. The memory of him dissolved into the phrase, "commissions from trust." And this formula became far more frightening than any personal condemnation, because it identified the scheme itself. Not a personal vice, but a system. Sometimes it seemed that the main result was not the ban or the returned coins, but the emergence of a common language for talking about boundaries. People learned to distinguish between where there was a spark of controversy about things and where there was a shadow of outside influence, where there was help and advice, and where there was an attempt to sell air under the name of honor. Scribe, notaries, guild elders, and even parish mentors, repeating the same formulas, broke down the fog into buttons and labels. There was a lot of boredom in this language, but boredom turned out to be the cure. It drove out of the corners of fear that special tremor that the experts had been speculating on. And if anyone tried to offer insurance against a disgraced marriage again, they were greeted at the town hall door by the same sign: "Insurance is permitted for losses that can be publicly verified. Any promises to compensate for the unprovable are worthless." And next to it, "Notaries do not have the right to stamp such papers." These 2 sentences saved more homes than dozens of vague sermons on morality, because instead of appeals, they provided a mechanism. At the end of one of the thick folders where case extracts were stored, there was a sheet with a brief summary written by the same clerk who had once noticed the first inconsistency in the penalty book. The summary consisted of 3 lines. The first, "The myth, financial protection, of what is not considered a thing, is broken down into formulas." The second, "The document, a list of verifiable conditions, a list of rights and obligations, is incorporated into marriage contracts and guild rules." Third, threats of libel suits were repelled by these 3 lines and crumbled. Between the lines was a silence similar to that which reigns in an empty office after closing time, when all you can hear is the stove cooling down. This silence does not promise paradise, but it does make it possible to live without intermediaries trading in anxiety. And then, the city will go back to business as usual. Salt, fabrics, courts, weighing sacks, household transfers, and if, years later, someone again brings a shiny parchment sign saying, "Protective Policy of Honor," it will be placed next to the sign on the door, and they will calmly say in the language of the charter, "The item is not there, verification is impossible, the promise is insignificant, the contributions are subject to return." The memory of the city absorbs reform, not when the sealing wax is extinguished and the decrees are laid out in boxes, but when people stop looking for loopholes in the most mundane things. This is what happened here. The habit of checking who signs, what confirms the subject of the contract, where the coins go, became established not only in the town hall, but also in homes, in kitchen notebooks, in the neat notes of housekeepers, in the instructions to notary apprentices. On this basis, the next layer of protection grew, which had not occurred to anyone before. Families began to insure not myths, but real risks associated with property and travel, and thus, oddly enough, finally closed the loophole for selling honor. When the question of future residence came up in marriage negotiations, a clause was included in the contract, giving the wife the right to return to her relatives for a season in the event of her husband's prolonged illness, while retaining part of her dowry. When discussing the shop, the share of income was not recorded in general terms, but was tied to days and seasonal fluctuations in fares. When it came to security, they specified who would pay for the escort of goods along dangerous roads. These clauses seemed dry and even stingy, but it was they that transformed the care of the home from a refuge of rumors into arithmetic, where things followed clear lines. In this new topography, there was no room for myth. There was no place for it between the columns of the ledger. A case in which this change was particularly evident began with an ordinary dispute over a room in the house. The young wife, an adult who had been raised in a tailor's house, had the right under the marriage contract to a separate workshop where she kept tools and fabrics for her own work. Her husband's relatives, accustomed to managing the house according to old customs, tried to take over the room for salt storage, explaining that it was for the benefit of the family business. In previous years, such conflicts were followed by whispered negotiations, leading to moral receipts, peace agreements, and other tricks, where vague obligations not to discredit appeared instead of specific items. Now the dispute took a different turn. The notary raised the marriage contract, saw the register of personal belongings and the clause about the workroom. The head of the Tailors' Guild sent an excerpt from the charter on the protection of the tools of a craftswoman's wife. The magistrate appointed a closed hearing, and there was no room for former mediators. The subject was measurable, the charter was applicable, and the room was subject to specific protection. The husband's relatives received an order within the time limit, specified by the words, "no more than 30 days," to take the salt to the common warehouse and compensate the workers' downtime with cloth, calculated in monetary terms. Not a single reference to good name, not a single hint of disgrace, only weight, length, deadline, and signature. This case remained inconspicuous in the archives, but it was precisely such inconspicuous cases that burned away the possibility of old grudges. Meanwhile, the clerk, who from the very beginning had been thinking about the mechanics of translating fear into accounting, took on what people usually don't like to do, compiling a brief set of standard formulations so that any decision of the magistrate could live without him. The compendium included sample marriage clauses on personal boxes, the right to tools, the distribution of income from the shop, seasonal absences, and the arbitration procedure for property disputes. In a separate column, he listed prohibitive phrases that cut off the path to the restoration of fictitious insurance. It is not permitted to include in contracts monetary consequences for events that are not subject to public verification. It is not permitted to stamp papers where the subject is the assessment of character. It is not permitted to give force to the signatures of people without guild or city authority. The code became a reference book for notaries and, along with them, spread to neighboring cities. Thus, a document that once arose from the opposition of a single network of commission agents became a stable language spoken by different cities, without agreeing on morality, but coinciding in mechanics. Of course, this did not negate the desire of individuals to restore the old power in their homes. In one neighborhood, there was a delay in the delivery of salt, and the elders of the houses tried to pressure the young people by offering compromise letters of tranquility, which were not policies in the old sense, but promised monetary satisfaction if rumors crossed the threshold. The papers were brought by a man who had once been an assistant to a mediator. His hand gave him away with a recurring formula. He always left a wide margin for monetary interpretation at the end, and selected the list of witnesses from people who owed him favors. Now these letters faced two new obstacles. The first was the refusal of notaries to touch such texts, even as copies, with the obligatory note, "without subject." The second was the reaction of the market. Merchant houses, taught by the mistakes of past years, ceased to recognize friendly assurances as elements of dowry negotiations and demanded exclusively lists of items and shares. It looked like a front without a battle. The wandering keeper of peace brought his goods, and they looked at him as if he were a colorful rag at a fair, eye-catching, but not worth the price. At the same time, an important but almost invisible correction was taking place in church practice. While retaining the right to talk to families about reciprocity and charity, parish priests refused to issue any notes for use in secular disputes. They recorded an internal rule in their parish books. Requests for confirmation of good reputation should be sent to a notary, and requests for punishment of whispering to a magistrate, and in neither case should the parish seal be used. This finally separated the spiritual sphere from the commercial and property spheres, and deprived the latter of the opportunity to rely on sacred authority in matters where only verifiability was required. The importance of this decision cannot be overestimated. The former broker network, as the investigation showed, stood on three legs: recommendations from wealthy houses, smoothing donations, and vague church powers of attorney. Remove one leg, and the network will wobble. Remove two, and it will collapse. Here, everything collapsed at once, because neighboring cities, familiar with the magistrate's decision, took turns adopting similar rules. Big politics loomed on the horizon. The empire's major cities argued over the right to levy taxes on fares, and in a century-long dispute over control of the salt routes, one house or another received privileges. Such changes always bring with them people who are ready to sell acceleration. Former broker agents tried to redirect their skills to certificates of reliability for warehouses, but here they were met with a wall of long-established procedures. There were fire inspection rules for warehouses, guard protocols for caravans, and bill of exchange formulas for transactions. The attempt to stick a moral paper on top of this looked as ridiculous as a colored flag on a scale. Merchant elders sent such consultants to the gate, where the measuring table stood, and there they were left with only the aftertaste of someone else's craft. However, the most important aspect of the change is not visible from the town hall or the shops, but from the almshouse and the school. In the almshouse, where women used to come to ask for letters of protection, they now asked for forms to file complaints about coercion into worldly papers and the withholding of items recorded as personal. The forms were simple, with no words about honor and glory, only lines about the subject, time, witnesses from among the neighbors, and a reference to the marriage point. These complaints were dealt with routinely, and often ended in either a fine, an obligation to return the items, or a written warning to relatives. At the City School for Scribes, teachers explained to students why unvalidated events cannot be turned into money, and used examples to show how myth causes people to confuse community authority with power. This education worked with a delay, like an oven that takes a long time to heat up but then stays warm. Graduates left for neighboring cities and brought with them intolerance for verbal smuggling under the guise of a contract. The further promotion of the new discipline touched on another delicate issue, the borderline between domestic custom and city law. Some households kept a code of good rules where family habits were recorded. Who gives up their seat at the table to whom, when who should return from the store, who takes the keys to the pantry. The former accomplices of the mediator tried to turn these codes into a tool of pressure by suggesting that lines about money shortages and disgraceful rumors be inserted into them. The trick was that the code was considered internal and did not require a seal. The magistrate responded with a subtle but decisive construction. Internal records are recognized in matters of daily life and order, but any lines that have financial consequences are not valid without notarization. At the same time, when faced with such lines, the notary is obliged to insert a standard formula into the contract prohibiting financial consequences for unprovable events. Thus, the habit of domestic order remained in place, and the attempt to let the monetary lever back into the house through rumors stopped at the threshold of the notary's office. One of the last surges of the old type of control occurred where it was least expected, in a brotherhood of philanthropists. Several respected ladies and 2 senior merchants decided to issue letters of guarantee for moral prudence to young couples, distributing these letters as tokens of care. The letters supposedly did not involve money, but in reality, they became a lever in family disputes. Such a letter was brought to the magistrate's meeting, along with a complaint about an attempt to use it to reduce the dowry. In response, the court did not accept loud words, but proceeded to analyze the powers. The Brotherhood has the right to distribute alms and organize care, but does not have the right to issue papers that are used as evidence in property cases. Along with the decision, a memo was issued to the Brotherhoods. Any note affecting property consequences is null and void without notarization and a verifiable subject. Brotherhoods that value their public reputation quickly removed risky forms because their power is based not on threats, but on trust. Against this backdrop, a final shift slowly matured, one that would go unnoticed if one looked only at the stamped paper. A new silence entered the city, not cowardly or imposed, but calm. It could be felt in the way people stopped mentioning other people's good names during negotiations, stopped bringing unstamped papers into their homes, and spent their evenings in the kitchen counting flour and firewood rather than recounting their neighbors' arguments. This silence became the opposite of the silence that had previously bought peace. Previously, people were silent out of fear of libel suits and a network of recommendations. Now, they were silent because the dispute had moved from the foggy realm of words to the clear realm of things, numbers, and deadlines. In this clarity, there was no place for honor insurance, just as there is no place for a floating market in the icy tundra. It simply cannot function there. And yet, for the sake of completeness, we must mention those who lost and did not calm down. Among them was a house that once paid contributions to a broker and failed to get everything back. Their notebook still contained lines about consolation expenses. For years, they harbored resentment and dreamed of revenge. One autumn, their elder tried to set up a morality committee in the neighborhood, without seals, without statutes, just a gathering of respected heads. The committee quickly began issuing warnings, followed by recommendations not to enter into matrimonial unions with certain houses. This time, The town hall did not wait for the warnings to be turned into a financial lever. It issued a decree that combined the experience of recent years in a single line. Any collective letters influencing property decisions without city registration are invalid, and their authors are subject to a fine for interfering with the order of concluding transactions. The committee disbanded before it could turn into another network of commission agents. The guards did not arrest anyone, and there were no show trials. There was only the immutability of language: subject, verification, authority, registration. Like a stone threshold, it broke old habits until those who stumbled over it left them outside. On the last page of the summary folder, the clerk made a note for those who would come after him. There were no names or dates in the note, only 3 pairs of words separated by a thin line. On one side were myth, financial protection of honor, community authority, and letter of peace. On the other side were document, insurance against material loss, guild authority, and marriage clause and registry. Between the pairs, he drew 2 thin arrows. One went from myth to document, with the caption, "Breakdown into verifiable elements." The other went from document to custom, with the caption, "Repetition until habit." This sparse drawing explained the outcome better than any story could. People did not become holier, the city did not become cleaner, but the practice of taking money for fear of strangers' words disappeared. The outcome was born of human decisions: to raise the statutes, cut off worthless papers, return contributions, teach notaries and scribes, separate the spiritual from the material, and make objects speak instead of smoke. And that is why the finale does not smell of victory cries. It smells of hot iron from the furnace, ink, and bread. Where once colorful papers were laid out on the table with the promise to protect honor, now lies a short, almost boring formula. Only what can be weighed, counted, and verified is insured. Everything else is insignificant and subject to return. This formula does not sound moral, but rather like the breathing fabric of life, which, having survived the tight knot of the commission network, has loosened and begun to move again, as befits a city ruled by statutes and customs, rather than by fear and the purchase of silence.